Let me ask you something that almost nobody is asking out loud. Why is the Middle East on fire again right now at this exact moment in history? Not 10 years ago, not 20 years from now, right now. Is it religious extremism, ancient tribal hatreds, the ambitions of rogue states? Or is it something hiding in plain sight? Something so enormous, so staggeringly obvious once you see it, that it almost feels embarrassing that it took this long to notice. I want to show you a number, $37 trillion. That is the size of the United States national debt as of right now. $37 trillion. You ran Eid Bain Eid. To put that into perspective, if you started counting $1 per second the moment Jesus of Nazareth was born, you still would not have reached $37 trillion by today. You would not even be halfway there. It would take you over 1,000,000 years. $37 trillion. And I am going to argue carefully, step by step, that this number, this obscene accumulation of borrowed money, is one of the most important keys to understanding what is happening in the Middle East. Not the only key, but one of the most important ones that almost nobody is talking about. Stick with me, because I promise you, by the end of this, the Middle East is going to look very different to you than it does right now. Let us start at the beginning, and I mean the real beginning. Not 2001, not 1948, not even 1916. Let us start with a simple question that economists ask. What happens when a country spends more than it earns for a very, very long time? The answer is, it borrows. And when it borrows enough, something strange happens. The debt stops being just a financial problem. It becomes a geopolitical problem. Because debt at scale changes what a country can afford to do, and more importantly, what it cannot afford to stop doing. Here is what I mean. The United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. That is the technical phrase. What it means in plain language is this. Almost every country on earth holds American dollars as a foundation of their financial system. When Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they pay in dollars. When Brazil trades with South Korea, the transaction is settled in dollars. The dollar is a blood of the global economy. Now, why does this matter for American debt? Because as long as the world needs dollars, as long as every country on earth is compelled to hold and use American dollars, there will always be demand for American debt. Countries buy American Treasury bonds. Pension funds around the world buy American Treasury bonds. Central banks from Beijing to Berlin to Brasilia buy American Treasury bonds. And as long as they keep buying, the United States can keep borrowing. And as long as the United States can keep borrowing, it can keep spending on its military, on its allies, on its interventions, on its wars. This arrangement has a name. The economist Michael Hudson called it super-imperialism. Others call it dollar hegemony. Whatever you want to call it, the mechanism is the same. America's ability to borrow endlessly is inseparable from the world's obligation to use the dollar. And the world's obligation to use the dollar is inseparable from one thing above all else, oil. In 1974, the Nixon administration, reeling from the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard, staring into the abyss of a dollar that was rapidly losing credibility, struck one of the most consequential secret deals in modern history. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh and made an arrangement with the Saudi royal family. The terms roughly were these. The United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi regime. American arms, American military protection, American diplomatic cover. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do two things. First, price all its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. Second, invest its surplus oil revenues, the so-called petrodollars, back into American Treasury bonds. The petrodollar system was born, and with it, the dollar was saved. Not by gold, not by American productivity or American exports, but by oil, by Saudi oil specifically. By the guarantee that if you wanted to buy energy, the lifeblood of every modern economy, you would first have to acquire US dollars. The collapse of the gold-backed monetary system in the early 1970s fundamentally transformed the foundations of American global power. Once the direct convertibility of the US dollar into gold came to an end, Washington faced a profound challenge. The dollar could no longer rely on precious metals alone to preserve its international credibility. A new source of demand had to be created, one that would ensure countries around the world continued to accumulate dollars, regardless of whether those dollars were backed by gold. The solution emerged through a strategic partnership with the oil-producing states of the Persian Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia. Under this arrangement, oil, the world's most indispensable commodity, would be priced and traded almost exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection, security guarantees, and political support for the Gulf monarchies. This arrangement, which later became known as the Petrodollar system, fundamentally reshaped international finance. The implications of this system extended far beyond the energy markets. Every nation that needed oil first needed dollars. Those dollars had to be earned through exports, borrowed from financial institutions, or accumulated through foreign exchange reserves. The result was a continuous and self-reinforcing global demand for the US currency. Countries purchasing energy were effectively participating in a financial ecosystem centered on Washington. To facilitate oil transactions, governments held large reserves of U.S. Treasury securities, conducted business through American financial institutions, and became increasingly integrated into a dollar-dominated international system. The dollar was no longer supported by gold. Instead, it was supported by the world's dependence on oil and by the unmatched military capabilities of the United States, whose naval power ensured that the sea lanes carrying that oil remained open. This is why the Middle East occupies such an extraordinary position within American grand strategy. To many observers, Washington's sustained engagement in the region appears excessive or even irrational. Yet viewed through the lens of global finance, the picture becomes considerably clearer. The Middle East is not merely a collection of energy-producing states. It is the geographical center of the financial architecture that has sustained American economic dominance for decades. The issue has never been solely about controlling oil supplies. Rather, it concerns what oil represents within the international monetary system. Oil priced in dollars generates global demand for dollars. Global demand for dollars sustains demand for U.S. government debt. That demand allows the United States to finance enormous fiscal deficits at relatively low interest rates. Those deficits, in turn, finance America's military, technological innovation, social programs, and worldwide geopolitical influence. Remove one layer of that chain, and the entire structure begins to experience strain. Understanding this connection becomes even more important when examining the extraordinary expansion of the American national debt. At the beginning of the 21st century, the United States owed approximately $5.7 trillion. Over the next quarter century, that figure increased more than sixfold, reaching approximately $37 trillion. This remarkable growth did not occur during a single crisis or war, but accumulated through years of tax reductions, military interventions, economic stimulus programs, financial crises, and rising entitlement obligations. Even more concerning than the size of the debt itself is the trajectory of interest payments. According to projections by the Congressional Budget Office, annual interest costs are expected to surpass total military spending within the coming decade. That would represent a historic milestone. For the first time, servicing existing debt would consume more federal resources than funding the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, nuclear deterrent, intelligence community, and global military infrastructure combined. This is not merely an accounting issue buried within budget documents. Throughout history, nations burdened by unsustainable debt often find their strategic choices increasingly constrained. Economic pressures influence foreign policy as much as military considerations do. Financial vulnerability creates incentives that may not exist under healthier fiscal conditions. A state facing escalating borrowing costs naturally seeks to preserve the conditions that allow inexpensive financing to continue. For the United States, one of those critical conditions has been the international role of the dollar. The privilege of issuing the world's primary reserve currency provides enormous advantages. It enables Washington to borrow on favorable terms because governments, corporations, and investors around the world require dollar-denominated assets. U.S. Treasury bonds are not simply domestic financial instruments. They serve as the backbone of the international monetary system. Central banks purchase them to stabilize their currencies. Sovereign wealth funds invest in them as safe assets. Commercial banks hold them as reserves. Pension funds view them as reliable stores of value. This exceptional demand keeps American borrowing costs lower than they might otherwise be. However, that privilege depends upon sustained international confidence in the dollar. If fewer countries require dollars to conduct trade, particularly energy trade, then fewer dollars must be held in reserve. Reduced demand for dollar reserves eventually translates into reduced demand for U.S. Treasury securities. Lower demand means higher interest rates. Higher interest rates dramatically increase the cost of financing an already enormous national debt. When the debt stands at $37 trillion, even relatively small increases in average borrowing costs can translate into hundreds of billions of additional dollars in annual interest payments. This structural reality helps explain why developments in global energy markets carry consequences extending far beyond commodity prices. The issue is not simply whether oil sells for $70 or $90 per barrel. It is whether oil continues to reinforce dollar dominance or begins supporting alternative financial systems. Historical episodes illustrate how these financial considerations sometimes intersect with geopolitical events, although they rarely serve as the sole explanation. Consider Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In 2000, Baghdad announced that it would begin selling its oil under the United Nations Oil for Food program using euros instead of US dollars. Many economists dismissed the decision as symbolic because Iraq's overall share of global oil production was limited. Nevertheless, the shift represented a direct challenge to the established convention that oil should be denominated in dollars. 3 years later, the United States led a coalition that invaded Iraq. The publicly stated justifications focused on alleged weapons of mass destruction and suspected links to terrorist organizations, claims that were later discredited or significantly weakened. Following the invasion and the establishment of the Coalition Provisional Authority, Iraqi oil exports quickly returned to dollar-denominated transactions. It would be intellectually irresponsible to argue that the currency issue alone caused the war. International conflicts almost always emerge from multiple overlapping strategic, political, military, and ideological factors. Yet it would be equally simplistic to ignore the financial dimension entirely. When one examines the sequence of events and the enormous importance of preserving dollar-denominated oil markets, it becomes difficult to dismiss the possibility that monetary considerations formed part of the broader strategic calculation. A similar discussion surrounds Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. During the final years of his rule, Gaddafi advocated the creation of a gold-backed African currency, often referred to as the gold dinar. His proposal envisioned African oil, minerals, and other commodities being traded through a monetary system independent of both the US dollar and the euro. Such a development, if successful, could have represented a significant symbolic and financial challenge to existing reserve currency arrangements. Following NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011 and Gaddafi's subsequent overthrow, the proposed monetary initiative disappeared entirely. Years later, documents released from the email correspondence of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton revealed discussions suggesting that French officials viewed Gaddafi's monetary ambitions as strategically significant. Again, caution is essential. Libya's civil conflict involved humanitarian concerns, regional politics, internal repression, and broader security considerations. Yet financial competition and reserve currency politics may have constituted one additional layer within an already complex geopolitical landscape. Recognizing these financial dynamics does not require embracing simplistic conspiracy theories. International relations rarely operate according to secret master plans directed from hidden rooms. Governments consist of competing institutions, elected officials, military planners, diplomats, intelligence agencies, economists, and political leaders, each pursuing overlapping but sometimes conflicting objectives. Policymakers genuinely worry about terrorism, nuclear proliferation, regional stability, humanitarian crises, alliance commitments, and domestic political pressures. These concerns are authentic, yet they coexist with structural economic incentives that often receive far less public attention. The significance of those incentives has increased dramatically as American debt has expanded. $37 trillion is not simply a large number, it represents an immense financial obligation, requiring continued investor confidence year after year. Any factor that threatens the international role of the dollar consequently acquires strategic importance. This brings us to one of the defining geopolitical developments of the 21st century, de-dollarization. Unlike sudden financial crises, reserve currency transitions generally unfold gradually. Countries rarely abandon an established monetary system overnight. Instead, they incrementally diversify their trading arrangements, reserve portfolios, and payment mechanisms. Over the past several years, numerous developments have reflected this gradual shift. China and Russia have increasingly settled portions of their energy trade using yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia has openly discussed accepting yuan for certain oil transactions with China. Brazil and China have expanded bilateral trade using their own national currencies. Members of the BRICS grouping have repeatedly emphasized their desire to reduce dependence on the US dollar while exploring alternative payment systems and reserve arrangements. These developments should not be exaggerated. The dollar remains overwhelmingly dominant across global trade, foreign exchange reserves, international banking, and financial markets. No immediate replacement exists. However, reserve currency transitions resemble erosion more than collapse. Confidence gradually weakens before visible changes suddenly accelerate. Every incremental reduction in global reliance upon the dollar modestly decreases demand for U.S. Treasury securities. Individually, these shifts appear insignificant. Collectively, over many years, they may substantially reshape global financial relationships. The implications become especially significant when viewed alongside America's growing debt burden. Higher borrowing costs generated by declining international demand for Treasury securities could significantly increase federal interest expenses. At debt levels approaching $37 trillion, even small changes in average yields produce enormous fiscal consequences. The Middle East once again occupies the center of this evolving picture. Saudi Arabia, historically the cornerstone of the Petrodollar arrangement established during the 1970s, has gradually diversified its strategic partnerships. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has cultivated closer relationships not only with Washington, but also with Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and numerous emerging economies. Saudi Arabia has strengthened economic cooperation with China, joined institutions associated with Eurasian integration, and expanded commercial ties beyond the traditional Western alliance. These actions do not necessarily indicate abandonment of the United States. Rather, they reflect prudent strategic diversification. Saudi leaders recognize that the global balance of economic power is changing. China's importance as an energy customer continues to expand. Russia remains influential within global energy markets. India represents one of the fastest-growing major economies. Simultaneously, mounting American debt and political polarization have raised questions about the long-term stability of the existing international order. Rational states frequently hedge against uncertainty rather than commit exclusively to one partner. Iran represents another important dimension of this transformation. Decades of American sanctions effectively excluded Tehran from much of the dollar-based financial system. Forced to adapt, Iran developed alternative trading mechanisms involving local currencies, barter arrangements, and closer financial cooperation with countries similarly interested in reducing dependence upon Western-controlled payment networks. Russia, China, Venezuela, and Belarus all became increasingly important economic partners. Consequently, Iran emerged not merely as a regional power challenging American influence, but also as a participant in broader efforts to construct financial systems operating outside traditional dollar channels. This alignment reflects practical economic interests as much as ideological opposition. Countries excluded from existing financial institutions naturally possess incentives to develop alternatives. Viewed from this perspective, the strategic convergence among China, Russia, and Iran appears more understandable. Their cooperation extends beyond military exercises or diplomatic coordination. Each possesses reasons to support a more multipolar international financial architecture in which dependence upon the US dollar gradually diminishes. These developments invite a broader and more difficult question. To what extent might contemporary instability in the Middle East be influenced, not entirely caused but influenced, by the financial pressures surrounding the international monetary system? This question requires careful handling because speculation can easily outrun evidence. There is no publicly available document proving that American policymakers deliberately seek regional instability to preserve dollar dominance. Such a simplistic interpretation would ignore the complexity of international politics. Nevertheless, structural incentives deserve consideration. When the stability of the world's largest debtor partially depends upon continued dollar-denominated energy trade, policymakers naturally possess strong incentives to preserve existing security arrangements. Those arrangements often reinforce America's role as the indispensable external security provider for Gulf monarchies. Instability itself may unintentionally strengthen those relationships. Regional tensions encourage Gulf states to maintain close defense cooperation with Washington, purchase American military equipment, and rely upon U.S. security guarantees. As long as these partnerships remain central to regional security, the broader financial architecture supporting dollar-denominated oil trade also receives indirect reinforcement. At the same time, intellectual honesty demands recognition that the United States is only one participant within an extraordinarily complicated regional environment. Russia maintains long-standing strategic interests rooted in Mediterranean access, historical influence, and great power competition. China prioritizes energy security, commercial expansion, and protection of critical trade routes connecting Asia with Europe and Africa. Iran pursues regional influence, shaped by revolutionary ideology, national security concerns, and historical identity. Turkey seeks strategic autonomy while balancing relationships between East and West. Israel focuses on national survival and regional security. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and numerous other regional actors each pursue independent agendas shaped by domestic politics and national interests. The Middle East cannot be reduced to a single explanation. Religious divisions, ethnic identities, historical grievances, colonial legacies, ideological conflicts, resource competition, demographic pressures, and external intervention all interact simultaneously. Financial considerations represent one important layer among many. Not the entire story, but certainly not an irrelevant one either. Looking toward the future, the structural pressures appear unlikely to disappear. Virtually every major fiscal projection anticipates continued growth in the American national debt. Neither major political party has demonstrated sustained willingness to implement the combination of spending reductions, entitlement reforms, military adjustments, and tax increases that would place federal debt on a decisively downward trajectory. The debate generally concerns the pace of borrowing rather than its existence. Meanwhile, de-dollarization efforts are also expected to continue. Additional bilateral currency agreements will likely emerge. Central banks may gradually diversify reserve holdings. Alternative payment systems will continue developing. Energy producers and consumers may increasingly experiment with transactions denominated in currencies other than the dollar. These two trajectories increasingly point toward one another. On one side stands a United States whose fiscal position makes continued international demand for the dollar exceptionally valuable. On the other stands a gradually evolving international system in which several major powers seek greater monetary independence. Their intersection will almost certainly influence future geopolitical competition. Given the central importance of global energy markets, the Middle East remains the most probable arena in which these competing financial and strategic forces will continue interacting. Not because the region is uniquely predisposed toward conflict, nor because its societies are inherently unstable, but because energy resources remain central to the functioning of the international economy. Where energy flows, capital flows. Where capital flows, strategic interests inevitably follow. Ultimately, the central argument is not that America's $37 trillion debt single-handedly explains Middle Eastern politics. Such a claim would oversimplify one of the world's most complex regions. Rather, the debt represents an essential yet frequently overlooked variable that deserves inclusion alongside more familiar explanations involving religion, ideology, ethnicity, terrorism, regional rivalries, and great power competition. The petrodollar system, forged after the collapse of Bretton Woods, created a durable relationship between American financial strength and Middle Eastern energy markets. As American debt expanded, Preserving confidence in that system became increasingly important. As de-dollarization slowly gathers momentum, pressures on that system likewise continue to intensify. These overlapping realities do not dictate every policy decision, but they shape incentives, influence strategic calculations, and help explain why successive American administrations, regardless of political party, repeatedly find themselves drawn back into the Middle East despite promises to pivot elsewhere. Debt is far more than a figure recorded on government balance sheets. It is a strategic constraint that influences diplomacy, military deployments, financial policy, and global alliances. It shapes incentives that may remain invisible to ordinary citizens following daily headlines. Appreciating this dimension does not require abandoning traditional explanations of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Instead, it enriches them by revealing how international finance and global power have become deeply intertwined. When future crises emerge across the Gulf, when new security partnerships are announced, when debates arise over sanctions, oil production, shipping lanes, or currency settlements, it may be worth looking beyond the immediate headlines. Beneath the visible politics lies a deeper financial architecture connecting energy, currency, debt, and power. Understanding that hidden structure offers a more comprehensive explanation for why the Middle East continues to occupy such a central place in American strategy, and why it is likely to remain there for many years to come.